She pushed away $10,000 while staring into the eyes of a killer. A night of work, in a blackout, with his blood still on her table. The next morning, the SUVs arrived and blocked the entire street. Yolanda Wallace Wallace is a tailor whose only sanctuary, a crumbling storefront, is days away from being taken by the bank. One midnight, the city's most feared man, Herberto Overa Henriquez, stumbles into her shop, bleeding and desperate. He offers her a fortune to fix the suit that will let him walk into a peace summit unnoticed. She refuses every cent. What Yolanda doesn't realize is that by treating a monster like a man, she has done the one thing his money couldn't buy. She earned his loyalty. Let's go back to the midnight knock that started a revolution. If you're new here, subscribe for raw Mafia stories where power, loyalty, and consequences collide. No sugarcoating, no excuses. The smell of old steam and pressed wool usually brought Yolanda comfort, but tonight it felt like the scent of a closing tomb. She sat at her heavy oak cutting table, the wood scarred by decades of scissors and needles, and emptied her small metal cash box. The sound of coins hitting the surface was hollow, a light, tinny clatter that didn't hold the weight of survival. She counted it once, then she counted it again, as if her desperation could manifest another bill between her fingers. $42.65. Yolanda looked up at the wall where her mother's portrait hung. The shop had been in the Wallace family since 1974, a sanctuary where the neighborhood's Sunday best was born and where heartbreaks were mended along with hemlines. But the neighborhood was changing. The local gangs had started taxing the street, and the banks, cold and indifferent, didn't care about a legacy built on straight seams and honest work. Her eyes drifted to the yellow paper taped to the glass of the front door, the bold red lettering visible even in the dim twilight. Final notice of foreclosure. The bank wanted $881 by Friday morning. It might as well have been $1 million. Yolanda looked at her hands, calloused, steady, and gifted, and felt a wave of bitterness. She had spent 40 years fixing the world's tears, but she couldn't find a way to patch the hole in her own life. She stood up and walked to the window, watching the first heavy drops of a gathering storm streak the glass. Across the street, a group of young men in hoodies leaned against a rusted fence, their eyes scanning the block like predators. The impossible math of her life was finally catching up to her. If she lost this shop, she wasn't just losing a business, she was losing her history, her dignity, and the only home she had ever known. She turned off the main overhead light to save on the electric bill, leaving only the small, warm glow of her 1984 Singer sewing machine. The machine sat there like a loyal soldier, waiting for a battle that Yolanda wasn't sure she could fight anymore.
She sat down and ran her hand over the cold metal of the machine, a silent prayer for a miracle caught in her throat. The rain began to lash against the storefront in earnest, a low, rhythmic drumming that drowned out the sound of her own heavy breathing. She was alone in her sanctuary, and for the first time in her life, the sanctuary felt like it was crumbling around her. The sky over the neighborhood didn't just darken, it bruised, turning a heavy, swollen purple before the clouds finally ruptured. Rain slammed against the pavement with a violence that made the old glass of Yolanda's storefront shudder in its frame. Inside, the rhythmic tick of the wall clock was the only thing keeping time against the chaotic drumming on the roof. Yolanda sat by her machine, the small lamp casting a golden circle over a half-finished hem, but her needle remained still. Her attention was anchored elsewhere. Through the distorted, water-streaked window, she saw it. A sleek, black sedan. It hadn't just passed by, it had pulled to the curb, its engine a low, predatory hum that she could feel in the soles of her feet, even through the floorboards. Minutes stretched. In this part of the city, a car like that, idling, silent, and expensive, was never a harbinger of good news. It was either the bank coming to put a lock on her dreams or the tax collectors from the street come to take what little was left. Yolanda's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. She gripped the edge of her table, her knuckles white against the dark wood. She thought of the foreclosure notice. She thought of the men she had seen earlier. Every shadow in the street seemed to lengthen, reaching toward her door. The car sat motionless for 5 minutes, then 10. The headlights were off, but the exhaust curled up into the rain like ghost breath. Yolanda felt a cold sweat prickle her neck despite the humidity of the storm. She reached out and slowly, carefully, turned off her small sewing lamp. She didn't want to be a silhouette. She wanted to be part of the shadows. She retreated toward the back of the shop, her hand searching for the heavy iron shears she kept on the counter, the only weapon she had. The silence inside the shop was now so thick it felt like it was drowning her. Just as she considered picking up the phone to call her neighbor, the car's engine revved slightly. The sound was deep, mechanical, and final. Then the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out into the deluge, his silhouette tall and imposing, cutting through the gray sheets of rain. He didn't run for cover. He walked with a slow, measured confidence toward her door, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Yolanda backed away until her spine hit the cool metal of her mother's old filing cabinet. The bell above the door, the one that usually signaled a friendly neighbor or a local bride, was about to ring, and for the first time in 40 years, Yolanda was terrified to answer it.
The bell above the door gave a sharp, lonely chime as the heavy wood swung open, dragging a gust of cold, wet air and the scent of ozone into the shop. The man who stepped inside didn't just fill the doorway. He seemed to command the very oxygen in the room. He was drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead, and a dark, expensive overcoat hung heavy on his shoulders. But it was his face that made Yolanda's breath hitch. Hard angles, eyes like flint, and a presence that screamed of a man used to making life-and-death decisions before breakfast. Heberto Olvera Enriquez. Yolanda recognized him instantly from the hushed warnings of the neighborhood and the blurry photos in the local news. He was the shadow over the city, a man whose name was whispered more than spoken. He didn't speak at first. He stood there, water dripping from his chin onto the floor she had scrubbed just that morning, his chest rising and falling in jagged, shallow breaths. He moved his hand from his side, and Yolanda saw the dark, spreading stain on his white shirt, blood, thick and crimson. In his other hand, he clutched a silk suit jacket that looked as if it had been through a meat grinder, the sleeve nearly severed and the lapel shredded. Yolanda's grip tightened on the iron shears, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wanted to scream, to run out the back door into the rain, to beg him to leave. But as he took a staggering step toward the counter, the light from her small lamp caught his eyes. The flinty hardness was still there, but beneath it, Yolanda saw something she hadn't expected, a raw, vibrating desperation. It wasn't just the pain of the wound, it was the look of a man carrying a weight that was about to crush him. He wasn't looking at her like a predator. He was looking at her like a man staring at a lifeboat from the middle of a dark ocean. "I was told you were the best," he rasped, his voice a low grate of sandpaper. He laid the ruined jacket on the table with a trembling hand, smoothing the fabric as if it were a wounded child. "I have a meeting at dawn, a peace summit. If I don't walk into that room looking like the man they fear, 300 families won't see tomorrow. The streets will run red." The fear in Yolanda's chest didn't vanish, but it shifted. She looked at the blood on the table, then at the final notice on her door, and finally at the man standing before her. He was a monster to the world, but in this moment, in the dim light of a failing shop, he was just a man with a broken thing that only she could fix. The tailor in her, the woman who had spent 40 years mending the world's tears, took a slow, steadying breath.
She set the shears down on the counter.
"Put the jacket on the form," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "and sit down before you bleed out on my good rug." The storm finally claimed the neighborhood's fragile power grid with a sudden metallic pop from the transformer down the street. The shop plunged into a thick, suffocating darkness, leaving only the sound of the rain and the heavy, wet breathing of the man in the corner. Yolanda didn't panic. She had lived through enough Houston summers to know where the emergency supplies stayed. With practiced movements, she struck a match, the sulphurous scent blooming as she lit 2 hurricane lanterns. The amber glow flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows across the spools of thread and the gleaming silver of her needles. She moved her 1984 Singer near the light, but the electric motor was useless now. She reached down and unlocked the treadle, the manual foot pedal her mother had taught her to use for pride work. "Hand cranked and foot powered," Yolanda murmured, more to herself than him. "The old ways don't need the city's permission to work." She draped the ruined silk jacket across her lap. It was a masterpiece of Italian tailoring, now weeping at the seams. As she began to pick out the shredded threads, Herberto sat in the shadows just beyond the lantern's reach, applying a clean cloth to his side. The rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the treadle began to fill the room, a steady heartbeat in the dark. "There are 2 families," Herberto said suddenly, his voice low and vibrating with the pain he was trying to hide. "The Olveras and the Castillos. For 10 years we have shared the docks, but a shipment went missing last week. Blood has already been spilled." Yolanda's needle moved with surgical precision. She didn't look up. "And this jacket you needed to play the part of a king who isn't bleeding? The peace summit is at 5 a.m. If I walk in there looking weak, the Castillos will see an opening. They'll strike, and they won't stop at the docks. They'll come through these streets, Yolanda. They'll turn every storefront into a battlefield. My men will respond in kind. By noon, this neighborhood will be a graveyard." Yolanda felt the weight of his words and the tension of the silk. She wasn't just mending a garment, she was stitching together the fragile piece of her own front porch. Every time her foot pressed the treadle, she imagined she was pushing back the tide of violence he described. "I grew up in the 70s, she said softly, the lantern light reflecting in her focused eyes. "I remember when these streets were filled with kids playing under hydrants, not men hiding in SUVs. My mother always said a hole in a community is just like a hole in a suit. If you don't catch the first thread, the whole thing unspools." Herberto watched her, his unreadable expression softening for the briefest of moments. For 4 hours, the only sound was the storm and the tireless mechanical rhythm of the tailor. In the dim, flickering gold of the lanterns, the Mafia boss and the seamstress sat in a shared silence, 2 people from different worlds trying to hold a dying city together, 1 stitch at a time. The final knot was tied with a flick of the wrist, the silk thread vanishing into the charcoal fabric as if it had never been torn. Yolanda stood up, her joints popping after hours of stillness, and draped the jacket over the mannequin. In the flickering amber light of the hurricane lanterns, the suit looked regal, untouched by the violence of the night. It was more than a garment now. It was a suit of armor for a man about to face a war. Herberto stood slowly, his face pale, but his eyes burning with a renewed intensity. He reached into his overcoat and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He laid it on the scarred wood of the cutting table. The flap was unsealed, revealing a stack of $100 bills so dense it looked like a brick. 10,000, Herberto said, his voice regaining its gravelly authority. "It's a start. For your silence, for your skill, and for your time. Take it. There will be more when the peace is signed." Yolanda looked at the envelope. It was the answer to every prayer she had whispered for the last 6 months. It was the foreclosure notice disappearing. It was the light staying on. It was the weight of the world lifting off her chest. She reached out, her fingertips brushing the paper, and for a second the room felt silent enough to hear her own heart. Then
She pushed the envelope back toward him. Eberto froze, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "It's not enough? Name the price, Yolanda. I don't haggle with people who save my life." "It's not about the amount, Mr. Enriquez," Yolanda said, her voice soft but unbreakable. She looked him directly in the eye, refusing to flinch. "My mother used to say that if you see a person drowning and you throw them a rope, you don't send them an invoice for the cord. If I take that money, I'm not a neighbor helping a man prevent a war. I'm just another person profiting from the blood on your shirt." "You are starving, woman," Eberto rasped, glancing at the final notice still visible in the shadows by the door. "I can see the math in your eyes. Take the money and save your shop." "I'd rather lose my shop standing on my own 2 feet than lean on it by a debt of the soul," she replied. She picked up the jacket and handed it to him, the silk cool and smooth. "Go to your meeting. Stop the bleeding in this city. That's how you pay me back. But this stitch, this one, was for free." Eberto took the jacket, his hands lingering on the fabric. He looked at her with a depth of respect that held more weight than any currency. He didn't argue. He tucked the envelope back into his pocket, gave a single solemn nod, and stepped out into the fading rain.
Yolanda watched his taillights vanish into the gray dawn, standing alone in her dark shop, penniless but entirely whole. The sun rose over the neighborhood with a deceptive, pale beauty, glinting off the puddles left behind by the midnight deluge. Yolanda hadn't slept. She had spent the pre-dawn hours sitting in her mother's old rocking chair, staring at the scarred table where the drowning man had stood. As the first true light of Friday morning hit the glass, she rose to face the end of her legacy. Today was the deadline. Today, the bank would come for the keys. She was reaching for the percolator when she heard it, a low, synchronized rumble of heavy engines that made the tea sets on her shelf rattle. It wasn't the rattling of a city bus or a delivery truck. This was the sound of precision. Yolanda moved to the window and pulled the edge of the curtain back just an inch. Her heart stopped. 3 black SUVs, polished to a mirror finish, were parked at the curb, effectively sealing off the street. In the middle of the sidewalk, a line of 8 men stood in perfect, terrifying formation. They wore charcoal suits that fit like armor and sunglasses that hid any trace of humanity. They weren't leaning or talking. They stood with their hands clasped in front of them, motionless as statues. Yolanda's breath came in short, jagged gasps. She looked at the men, then at the final notice on her door, and then at the back exit. They're here to clean up the witness, she thought, a cold terror washing over her. She had seen too many movies and heard too many stories. She hadn't taken the money, but she knew his face. She knew his wound, and she knew the secret of his peace summit. She scrambled toward the back of the shop, grabbing her purse and a framed photo of her mother. Her hands were shaking so violently she dropped her keys. She didn't have a car, but if she could make it to the alley, she could disappear into the maze of the housing projects 3 blocks over. She reached the back door, her hand hovering over the heavy iron bolt, when a sudden, authoritative knock echoed through the front of the shop. It wasn't a violent bang. It was 3 slow, measured raps. Yolanda froze. She looked at the door, her reflection in the glass of the back exit showing a woman caught between flight and the crushing weight of her own history. She realized then that there was no running from men who could seal off a city block in broad daylight. She let out a long, shuddering breath, set the photo of her mother down on the ironing board, and smoothed her simple work dress. If this was the end of the Wallace Tailor shop, she would meet it at the front door. Standing straight with a trembling hand, she walked back to the front, gripped the handle, and opened the formation. The door of the central SUV opened with a heavy, pressurized thud, and Herberto Olvera Henriquez stepped out. He looked different in the unforgiving clarity of the morning sun. The soaked, desperate man from the night before was gone, replaced by a figure of absolute, terrifying authority. He wore the charcoal silk jacket Yolanda had labored over, not a single stitch out of place, the repair so seamless it looked like the fabric had healed itself. The line of suited men didn't move, but their presence felt like a physical weight as Herberto walked toward the shop. Yolanda stood her ground behind the screen door, her fingers white-knuckled as she gripped the handle. He stopped just inches from the threshold, his expression as unreadable as a stone monument. For a long, suffocating moment, neither of them spoke. Yolanda searched his eyes for the vulnerability she had seen by lantern light, but it was buried behind a wall of cold, professional steel. "The meeting was a success," Herberto said, his voice no longer a sandpaper rasp, but a smooth, resonant baritone. "The Castillos saw a man who was whole, a man who was ready. The peace was signed at 4:30 this morning. There will be no war." Yolanda felt a brief flicker of relief, but the sight of the men behind him kept her heart in her throat. "I'm glad to hear it, Mr. Enriquez. Now, if you've come to thank me, you've done it. But I told you, my work wasn't for sale." Herberto tilted his head slightly, the ghost of a smile touching the corner of his mouth. "You refused my cash, Yolanda. You said you wouldn't charge a drowning man for a rope. I respected that, but the storm has passed, and I am no longer drowning." He gestured to the man beside him, a sharp-eyed individual carrying a leather briefcase. "This is my lead counsel. You see, I spent the morning realizing that my organization has plenty of men who know how to break things. I have very few who know how to fix them with your level of integrity." He stepped closer, his shadow falling across her floor. "I'm not here to pay a bill, Yolanda. I'm here to put you on retainer. I am moving my operations into legitimate holdings, real estate, logistics, security. My people will need uniforms, my executives will need tailoring, and I need a director of operations who cannot be bought by an envelope of cash." He looked at the foreclosure notice on her door and then back at her. "You kept your soul last night. Today, I'd like to help you keep your shop, not as a gift, but as a down payment on a partnership. I don't just want a tailor. I want the conscience of this neighborhood on my payroll." The lawyer stepped forward, his movements as sharp and efficient as the crease in his trousers. He opened the leather briefcase and withdrew a single heavy vellum folder. There was no fanfare, only the distant sound of a siren somewhere in the city and the steady, grounding presence of Herberto standing behind his men.
"This," the lawyer began, his voice clinical yet respectful, "is the recorded deed for this property. The lien held by the bank was settled in full at 8:01 a.m. this morning. The title has been transferred into a trust under your name, Yolanda Wallace. You are now the sole owner of this land and this building." Yolanda's hand went to her mouth, her breath hitching. She looked at the paper, at the official seal and the red "paid in full" stamp that seemed to glow against the parchment. The $881 debt that had felt like a mountain was gone, vanished as if it were nothing more than a stray thread. But as her eyes moved down the document, she saw the second page, a corporate service agreement. "Mr. Henriquez is serious about his transition," the lawyer continued, handing her a gold-plated pen. "This contract establishes a 5-year exclusive partnership. You will oversee the design and production of uniforms for his new legitimate security firm and logistical fleet. There is a signing bonus and a monthly retainer that will allow you to hire 3 assistants immediately." Yolanda looked at Herberto. The power dynamic in the room had shifted. He wasn't just the boss of the underworld anymore. He was a tycoon building a new world, and he had chosen her to be its moral foundation. "The neighborhood is changing, Yolanda," Herberto said, stepping into the shop and looking at the portrait of her mother.
The Castillos and the others, they understand now that this block is under a different kind of protection. Not the kind that comes with a threat, but the kind that comes with a name. You keep your doors open. You keep your needles moving. My men will be the invisible walls around this sanctuary. She realized then that the silent partnership wasn't about control. It was about a debt of honor. Herberto wasn't just saving her shop, he was enshrining it. By refusing his blood money, she had forced him to offer her something better, his respect and the security of his shadow. With a hand that was finally steady, Yolanda signed the papers on the same scarred table where she had mended his silk jacket. The Wallace legacy wasn't just patched, it was reinforced with steel. As the lawyers filed out and the SUVs prepared to depart, Yolanda looked at her mother's portrait and smiled. The sanctuary wasn't crumbling anymore. It was becoming the strongest house on the block. 6 months to the day, the air in the neighborhood no longer felt heavy with the scent of ozone and fear. The evening was warm and gold, the sunset bleeding amber light across the newly painted facade of Wallace Tailoring and Design. The storefront was no longer a crumbling sanctuary, it was a beacon. Large, clear windows displayed mannequins in sharp, custom-made security uniforms, and the final notice had been replaced by a small, hand-painted sign that read, "Where the community is sewn together." Inside, the hum of the 1984 Singer was joined by the rhythmic whir of 3 brand-new industrial machines.
Yolanda sat at her desk, reviewing the payroll for her new assistants, but her eyes kept drifting to the street. A black SUV sat at the curb, not as a predator, but as a silent guardian. The neighborhood felt different. The kids played under the hydrants again, and the local grocery store stayed open late, no longer fearing the shadows. Herberto had kept his word. The protection he provided was the quiet kind, the kind that allowed a community to breathe. At 8:45 p.m., just as Yolanda was preparing to lock up, the bell above the door gave its familiar, friendly chime. A young boy, no older than 17, stood there. He was wearing a cheap, oversized tuxedo that looked like it had been salvaged from a thrift store bin, his shoulders slumped with a weight far too heavy for a teenager. "Miss Yolanda?" he whispered, his voice cracking. I have prom tomorrow. My mom saved for months for this, but the sleeve, it caught on a fence." He held out the jacket, showing a jagged tear that ran from the elbow to the cuff. "I only have $15. I know it's not enough for a rush job, but I can work it off. I'll sweep, I'll take out the trash, anything." Yolanda felt a familiar ache in her chest, the echoes of a rainy midnight and a drowning man returning to her. She stood up, walked to the boy, and took the jacket with the same reverence she had shown Herberto's silk. She ran her thumb over the tear, her mind already calculating the stitch. $15 is a lot of money," Yolanda said softly, her eyes crinkling with a smile. She reached over and turned on the bright, modern LED lamp over her workstation, the light chasing away every shadow. "But you keep that for the flowers for your date. This one is on the house." "Wait, really?" the boy asked, his eyes widening with the same disbelief Herberto had once shown. "Why?" Yolanda led him to the stool and threaded her needle with a steady, practiced hand. "Because a long time ago, someone told me that you don't charge a person for the rope when they're trying to reach the shore. Now sit down, son. Let's get you ready for your big night." The treadle began to move, a rhythmic, hopeful heartbeat that pulsed through the shop and out into the safe, quiet neighborhood that had finally learned how to heal. If this story resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who might need it today. What would you have done in Yolanda's place? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you believe kindness still has power, support the story with a like and subscribe for more real stories where everyday people make extraordinary choices.